I'm very glad to hear that you've been reading this introductory essay to the Documenta, and very eager to hear your thoughts and responses. And I understand there was that you've gone through the first 2 or 3 pages, and that up until to be committed, excluding to be committed. And I understand that there's been quite a discussion, so I would love to be part of that, or to understand what that discussion is. Oh.
Is her name Leah? Leah.
Oh.
He's obviously should be back. Because
Oh.
Leah was a big part of the conversation.
Okay.
Along with Sybil.
Oh, okay. Well, in the meantime, then we can do one of 2 things at this point after this conversation to discuss these parts of the essays that you have read. One is to continue reading the essay and finish it, just so we get through it. And the other is to interrupt and look at some images of 2 stories in particular. I think I wanted to bring in the Mario Garcia Torres and Boetti story, and the Mike Rakovits story, that go out from the brain in the direction of matter, materials, relations, people, art, and Afghanistan in particular.
But that
So,
would link with the materiality of the Misha Ashton.
well, yes, it would, but in the other there's a whole part about
Yeah.
the opportunity or not opportunity to go to
Yeah.
work, also not in Kassel. So it can be done both ways. How do you feel, you who have been reading? Would you like to continue reading, and then we do the looking at these 2 stories in the next session? Or would you like to interrupt and look at these stories and then read in the light of the stories? It's 2 advantages, and 2, you can't, there's no, it's a sort of a win-win or lose-lose. Depends on your point of view.
Leave it up to you.
Oh,
Well, I'm going to suggest, what
Yes.
would happen if we did the stories in this session, since we've just got an hour and a quarter,
mhm.
and then we go back to reading, because we've done 3 reading
Yeah, 'cause we were
sessions.
reading yesterday, weren't we?
So I think it would be nice to hear
Okay.
you talk about the stories, and then go back to this with that.
Okay,
with
so
that in
then with
mind.
that in mind, we can continue the reading.
What's
Okay.
so nice is that you can read it many ways. You can keep opening it out in different ways.
Yes.
So that's
Yes.
fine.
Okay, so that will be the plan. And by the way, this essay is the introduction to the catalog of the Documenta, but it comes after a notebook, which was a notebook number 3 of the Documenta series, which was called Letter to a Friend, and that also had been published as a PDF given to the press together with the first press release of the Documenta. This is just a bit nuts and bolts, because someone asked me also about the nuts and bolts of...
Yeah.
I'm saying this as we
We've got some more
await
nuts
for
and
your
bolts.
colleague.
Yeah, we got some more nuts and bolts questions as well.
Yeah. But we want to wait for
Sorry,
the...
that might help contextualize how this came to be what it is. And
Yes.
because we're sorry, that might contextualize how this all came to be how it is.
Yes.
Because I think a lot of us are in the dark about the appointment of you and your team, and
that's
even
easy.
those kinds of
That's
things.
that's not even nuts and bolts. That's like, okay. So the fact is that in this moment we are waiting for one person to come and join, to then start again this discussion. And in the meantime, as we're waiting, we are going to speak about nuts and bolts, which some people can miss because it's not necessarily fundamental in this moment. Is that okay? So we speak about some nuts and bolts. So the one nut and bolt that you bring up is the appointment. And I had brought up another one that I wanted to tell you about. So the appointment is very simple. The Documenta is has a board of directors, which is made up of representatives of the CEO of the Documenta, plus representatives of the city of Kassel, the state of Hesse, and the federal government of the German state. And there are different people in there, including the Minister of Culture, who's of the federal state, who is usually delegated through a head of the cultural affairs of the Ministry of Culture. Then there is the Minister of Culture of the state of Hesia, and then there is the Cultural Minister of the city of Kassel. Those are three. Plus there are other representatives. There's someone who represents the financial office, money office of the city of Kassel, the one who represents that for the state of Hesia, and not the one who represents that for the federal government. These people that are about 12, I'm trying to answer your question, but you have a sub-question,
Yeah.
okay?
And do they change every time the government changes? And
No.
also, is this spanning many documenters, or is
Yes.
this... Okay.
Yes, the board of directors has, of course, people coming in and people coming out periodically, but they generally span many, many years. So there's a rotation. I cannot answer the exact question if it's 10 years, 15 years, or whatever, but the rotation is not everybody all at once. It's some people, like in a Supreme Court. So you have a continuity as well, and occasionally a change. The mayor of Kassel is the head of the board of directors. So that was Bertram Hilgen in my case, and also in the preceding cases of Okwi Enwezor, my predecessor.
Ruth Nowak and Roger Bergel.
Yes. We can talk about a nuts and bolts concerning Ruth and Roger also. Roger was nominated, not Ruth, and then Roger decided to co-curate it with his partner,
Yeah.
and Ruth was hired by Ralph.
Okay.
So it wasn't the board of directors that hired her.
Okay.
So that's just a technicality
Yeah.
that tells a lot about gender questions. But we will.
I was going to say those little things.
Yes, but let's try one nuts and bolts question, and then we'll open up. I mean, I just opened up the second one, and you opened up the. This board of directors, which is instantiated for many, many years, has no authority whatsoever in choosing the artistic director of the Documenta. They merely ratify the decision of the search committee, and they then subsequently meet every 6 months during the years of your work to support or not support, officially vote and approve things. For example, they had to approve that I would do the Documenta also in Kabul. And this is just a small example. In order to make that approval occur, I was very careful to not use any money coming from the money given by the government for the Documenta in Kassel, because I was afraid of some rejection possible by members of this board that would say, we are taking away money from artists in Kassel and it's tax money from Germany. Why are we doing that, spending it? And that was the reason why Catherine David, my predecessor, who had proposed to do part of the Documenta not in Kassel, was rejected on that plan. And knowing that story, I carefully avoided that. And found extra separate funding. It's kind of like applying for a Leverhulme. So I applied to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the government of Germany that normally does not fund Kassel Documenta at all, and the Goethe Institute, which is the cultural arm. It's like the British Council of the, you could call it the Ministry of Propaganda, or you could call it the Ministry of Worldly Relations. It depends on your perspective and if you're angry with them or not. But so that part of it was, I mean, I carefully funded it autonomously from the normal funding, and therefore went to the board and got that approved. But that was an example of having to approve things. But the nomination comes from the search committee. The search committee is a number of people. You can even Google it if we're online. The search committee for each Documenta changes, and it is nominated. It is a number of 8 to 12 people nominated by the CEO of the Documenta, the Ministry of Culture of the federal state, and the mayor of Kassel. Those 3 people nominate these 12 people. So if you look for the search committee of the Documenta 13, which is mine, you shall see who was on it. And it's a public search committee. It's not a secret. It is revealed about 8 to 10 months or a year into the process of searching.
So it's reconstituted.
Yes,
differently each year.
yes, yes. For example, this year, Osvaldo Sanchez from Mexico, curator, was on it, as was the director of the Museum MMK in Frankfurt. In my case, Kaspar Koenig was on it as a representative of German museums. He was the director of the Ludwig at that time. This year, Chris Dercon was on it as a representative of an international museum, the Tate in particular. At my time, when I was nominated, Lisanne McGregor was on it as a representative of an international museum. She is the director of the MCA in Sydney. And the vice director of MoMA, who used to be at Walker Art Institute, Catherine Halbright, was on it when I was nominated. Those were the two women. There were only two women in 11 or 12 people. The director of the Kunsthalle, Friedrichianum, is always usually on the search committee. At that time, I can't remember his name. He's gone now. He was on it, although he didn't speak. Yes, these were the people who were on my finding committee. So Udo Kittelmann, who at the time was the director of, I guess, Hamburger, no, of, yes, of all the Berlin museums, Hamburger Bahnhof and so on, all of them. Oskar Ho, he's a curator and critic in China. Lisanne, who was the director of the MCA Sydney. Manolo Borja Vilel, who is the director of the Reina Sofia, still the director of Reina Sofia in Spain. Kathy Halbright, who is the vice director of MoMA and was previously the incredibly great person who ran the Walker Art Center. And then Paolo Herkenhoff is the ex-director of the Sao Paulo Biennale, the one that was about anthropophagia, and he's an independent art historian and curator. He's a fantastic person. Bertram is the mayor of Kassel. Ryan Wolfs was the director of the Kunsthalle Friedrichianum, which runs the Friedrichianum in between the different things. Joseph Backstein is an independent curator in Russia, who also is the head of the Moscow Biennale. Kaspar Koenig, as I mentioned, was now he's retired, the director of the Ludwig. Okay, so these people were nominated by the board of directors of the Documenta, 3 members of it, meaning the representative of the Ministry of Culture, a wonderful woman. Maybe we can see that.
You want to go back?
No, I would like to see her name because she's a wonderful woman, fantastic. She was actually Catherine David's assistant during the Document of '97. Her, like, not assistant, but her right-hand, left-hand person. The same way Chus Martinez was. We never speak about Chus, but Chus is so important to Documenta 13, so important in ways that...
She's really present in the notebook.
Notebook?
In the...
Logbook.
Logbook, sorry.
Yes, well, I mean,
lovely.
we were like the Sisters Grimm, you know, of Kassel. And everybody would say, well, which one is the eldest of the 2 sisters? And I would say, I don't know. And at dinner we would discuss why the Brothers Grimm stopped the dictionary at the letter F at the word Frucht, fruit. Then they got bored and didn't do the dictionary anymore, the Wörterbuch, the Brothers Grimm. So that was one of our big topics of conversation, the letter F and fruit. Chus, she is wonderful. After the Documenta, she went off to be the chief curator of the Barrio Museum. To her great sadness and dismay, discovered that it was a very conservative, reactionary place funded by...
Just resigns from the...
Yes, she resigned. I haven't seen that. She resigned last week and accepted the position of director of the art school in Basel. So I will probably work for her because I would like to give some lectures and teach. I asked her, can I please teach at your school?
Brilliant.
That's so great that she did this. She took this courage, you know, because a woman can be considered crazy if she resigns from a job after a year. But these were a bunch of, you know, right-wing
There's a lot
Cuban...
of crazy women around doing that. I mean, Utameta Bar.
Yes,
and,
exactly. Utameta Bar.
And Ruth Noack from the Royal College.
Yes.
So something's
anyway,
going on
but
that's
she's
making
not
noise.
allowed to say, in her agreements, she's not allowed to say that she's joining the school in Basel until 10th of January. So It doesn't appear here, but she's actually already accepted that position and will make something wonderful with that school, I'm sure. Now, going back to the finding committee, so the board of directors who nominated these people involved the representative of the minister, which is this woman whose name I can't remember, Hortensia Volker. She was the person that did the Catherine David documenta with Catherine David, and after many years she got a job in the Ministry of Culture in Germany and made her way to running the whole program, basically. She is really the person running the whole contemporary arts program for the ministry. Hortensia, that's her name, yeah. So it doesn't matter, anyway, her and CEO Bernd Leifeld and who else? The mayor. They nominated the finding committee for Documenta 14, which nominated Adam Szymczyk. Okay, now that's Hortensia. She's amazing. So anything that's really great, in a way, in Germany is the fruit of great number of collaborations in people. I mean, obviously, not just Hortensia, that's clear. But she's working behind the scenes in a very quiet way. She doesn't have time to publish or write or teach or curate or anything, but she's really empowering a lot of people and making a lot of things happen. What is this?
I'm just looking for the 14 finding committee.
It's funny that Chus has gone to the art school of Basel and Adam Szymczyk is coming from the Kunsthalle of Basel, but there's no connection with Chus's job. It's not that she just took Adam's job because he was not at the school. It's a strange sort of entanglement. Anyway, now the finding committee included, for this one, as you can see, included Koyo Kuo, who was one of my, you would call them curators, but I don't call that curator. I call them agents, because they had different forms of agency, different types of agency. Chus was head of department, but there was no name for the department. So I did a lot of little bit surrealistic operations to shake things up. So she was head of department, but no department was named. And the curators were agents, and they could do more or less. This is really interesting in terms of nuts or bolts. I tried a very anarchist type of governance. So everybody could do as much or as little as they wanted who were involved. And it was a series of concentric circles. I first nominated a few agents, you know, like there were some people, the core group. The first person I actually talked to was an artist, René Gabry. And Irene, who brought in his partner, Irene, because he said, I'm not going to do it without Irene, because we do everything together. But I didn't really know Irene very well. I knew René Gabry. And now I know Irene really well. So I nominated, the first agents were René Gabry and Irene Anastas as an agent and a half. I remember we worked out that they would get the fee, like an agent and a half, because he also wanted 2 fees. And I said, but wait a minute, René, I mean, you share your thoughts together all day, all morning. There's got to be some advantage to me here too. So financially, so let's call it an agent and a half. You each get 75%, because otherwise then it's just not fair. I can't hire as many agents as I want. But I understand that it can't be half an agent each. So we worked that out. I mean, so everything was a case by case. It was all a process of case by case in the reality. So once I had René and Irene, and I wanted to hire René as an agent to be my PR person, the head of the Department of Communications. Can you imagine? The founders of 16 Beaver, which is the most radical sort of space in New York City, that organized, basically they half organized a bunch of things that occurred in New York over the past 2 or 3 years, and that spread around the world as well. And aside from their political activities and the things that they initiated there as activists, they also organized lectures and talks. I had spoken at 16 Beaver. 16 Beaver has a fantastic website, by the way, and so on. So I thought that 16 Beaver should run the Documenta Communications Department. In the end, they didn't, because they wanted to run everything. And therefore, I had to also hire a head of communications. And the only people that were dismissed were my 2 successive head of communications. I ended the Documenta with a 3rd. So there was only one department that was totally dysfunctional in my view, and I was dysfunctional for it. It was the communications department, which will bring us to this letter to a friend, which I was telling you.
How do we spell Beaver again?
Beaver, B-E-A-V.
As in animal.
E-R, as in the animal. It's a street. 16 Beaver is B-E-A.
Yeah, I thought I was going to be clever, and I'm sure they was going to spell it as Beaver.
That's it. 16 Beaver group, yeah. So it's lovely, isn't it lovely? So these are all the events they do. You can just click on one, and you know the need to abolish itself, money needed to abolish, things like that. So these agents, which then grew and grew and grew, at a certain, sometimes osmotically, an artist would become an agent. Like Pierre Huyghe only became an agent after about 1.5 years, because he kept helping me and giving me things, not information, but advice, and we were discussing so much, I realized that he was not only participating as an artist, he was actually participating as a maker of the whole. So at that point, I just changed him from being an invited artist to being an invited artist and an agent. So that's what I mean by a kind of organism, which was concentrically getting bigger, but a bit rhizomatic. And the agents, it was based on this principle, a kind of organic principle, which you might find not democratic at all. I don't know, I'm interested in your opinion on this. But each person could do as little or as much as they wanted. So and they had to actually do it. It's not like you just say, I'm going to do it, and then you don't do it. So, for example, Marta Kuzma, who was then at OCA, she was doing a lot of research on modernist women artists that I ended up showing many of, including Hannah Regan and also Emily Carr and also Maria Martins. And so there was this whole thread running through the documenta, and she was particularly interested in that, so she did a lot of research and she was working on it. So if you engaged a lot, or if you traveled a lot, you know, Raimundas was traveling a lot and working a lot, then they would go to a certain tier of salary. So you could earn very little or a lot. From like a minimum, I think, of 500 euros a month to a maximum of, I don't know, 2,500 euros a month or whatever. And it sort of depended on how much you wanted to do. Now, in a normal economy, you would say, well, I can't do it that way, because what if everybody wants to work a lot? Then we get stuck with no money. But I just trusted that that wouldn't happen, that the laziness or the disinterest or the many activities that people had in their lives would balance that, and those who wanted to do more would balance. And so it worked out perfectly. There was no over budget in my budget in salaries at all. And there was people with all sorts of different fees. And you could also move from one to another, you know, if you wanted to. So Bettina Funk, she was the agent for publications. You know, she ended up working full-time, moving to Kassel and so on, after the first 2 years, but at the beginning she was working very little. And of course, on the one hand, this reflects, unfortunately, the tragedies of precarious labor. So there's a downside to this, obviously.
But it also opens up flexibility.
Yes, but flexibility, we know, is the excuse for alienating laborers.
I know, but in sense, for an individual to be flexible at that particular time, to do what they want. I mean, sometimes I'd like a cut of wages just to be able to get some other work done. But in a university structure, it doesn't work like that. And if you're not in, you're thought to be not working, in a sense, you know, particularly where I am.
Yes, well...
But whereas, you know...
Can we use the mic?
I guess because that had an organic kind of structure. And it had to because of the very nature of the project.
Yes, the project was growing and didn't exist
project,
at the beginning.
yeah.
There was
Yeah.
very little to do. But,
Yeah.
but at the same time, I'm not idealizing this system.
No,
I see that there is a part, I mean, you can look at it as an example of the flexible, precarious labor of our times.
Yeah.
But I
you-
was part of it myself. You
Yeah.
know, my last salary was like 1.5 years ago.
But in a sense,
So-
you're dealing with people who are used to precarious labour in the culture industry
Yes.
anyway at the moment.
Yes, I know.
who are
I
used to
just
that
didn't want to
structure.
idealize it now.
No.
As saying
no.
I was so generous that everybody could do whatever they wanted.
Yeah.
I was also saying I'm also part of this mechanism, which is a bit diabolical.
But there's slow work and fast work, isn't there? You know, there are moments when you don't need to be doing the work, and there are moments when you do, like your publications
Yes,
person.
in fact, they didn't change their salaries from 1 month to another. It was maybe over minimum periods of, say, almost a year, like
Yeah.
6 months to 8 months. I mean,
Yeah.
they kind of decided at the beginning how they
Yeah.
wanted to be involved,
Yeah.
and that stayed until we did the new contract a year later. It was a yearly contract.
Some other questions that
Oh.
came up maybe before we go back to the reading, because these Are there other?
Did you want to talk about your meteorite, or not your meteorite, but the meteorite, and your perspective on the meteorite? Because you had a couple of questions, didn't you?
But so that's the text.
Oh, do you
I
want to
think
do that? Okay.
Griselda was asking,
No, yes,
is that,
no, I was wanting to.
Was that what you wanted to do?
I thought, okay,
Well, no, I mean,
No,
yes,
I-
actually, I know what
Just-
you wanted to do.
what?
You wanted to see the image, then come back to that later, didn't you?
No.
No. What we wanted to do is to find out what you had done in the first
Okay.
hour, and if
Yes.
there were questions over from that.
Yes.
Because now we've gone back to this sort of nuts and bolts and kind of discussion about this. You've set us on that way, so maybe that question, Leia's question, is good because we wanted.
And what was that question?
Well, what did you read and what is the debate
It was-
amongst
It
yourselves?
was different cultural perspectives on the meteorite, wasn't it? And you were pleased that it stayed where it was, and it was the debate around that for your particular reasons or
I mean,
particular
if
reasons.
you don't want to add it, don't worry. No, don't, there's
Yeah, you
no
don't
pressure,
have
we
to.
just wanted
You don't
create
have to.
the
It's
space for
fine.
that.
I'm actually interested
It was just an opportunity, if you wanted to
Okay.
continue that. It wasn't.
I suppose I was interested in the meteorite. I mean, it's a very interesting problematic because it's an object that has fallen in a particular location and therefore has become embedded in a place where certain people live, and it's not an object that has been made by Indigenous people. So it's a kind of a different discussion to the discussion it would be if it was something that had been made. And it reminds me of, for me it brings up issues of repatriation, because it's a kind of, because of the I'm interested in your ideas to do with the displacement, because I think Alison said it's not perhaps it wouldn't be a kind of equal displacement somehow. It was I'm trying to recall what I said this morning, but I think if I had a question, it would be, would it be possible to reverse the displacement? I'm quite interested in this site that the meteorite is in.
Yes.
And
How
what would
interesting.
it be to reverse the displacement and to bring something from Europe to that site? And what would that mean? Or how would that be practical?
Anything to add before I try to...
We were kind of saying, what would it be for to swap the meteorite for a piece of Stonehenge?
First,
A piece of Stonehenge. Okay, because it would.
Stonehenge is made by people. There was a distinction.
Yeah.
Excuse me, your first name?
Yeah.
Leah.
That's
Leah
right.
made a first distinction between
'Cause it
human-made and
yeah.
not human-made.
Yeah.
So
but we
you're
were
saying it should be swapped with something human-made?
Well, we were trying to decide what would be the thing it could be swapped for, okay, in terms of cultural significance for a culture or a
Yes,
community.
because it is not human-made, but it is of cultural significance.
Yeah.
So it would be like bringing the, what are those waterfalls in America? Yeah, like bringing Niagara Falls in a way. It's of cultural relevance because people go get married there and show the picture. And Hitchcock has done his movie, but you can't move the Niagara Falls. Well, first of all, I have to say this was not a curatorial proposition. It was the proposition of two artists, Argentinian, Nico and Guillermo. And Nico and Guillermo, therefore, would have to be asked that question, I think, more than me. I mean, we can speculate, but it was not a curatorial move like some curators might do, a move like this, propose it as a symbolic act to frame their exhibition. So shall we answer anyway, or shall we try anyway, or shall we, because what comes to my mind, I mean, what is important for me, things come in different chaotic way, but one thing that comes to my mind is that Nico and Guillermo are not indigenous artists. And because of that, it made it perhaps more, it opened up the problematization of this act of ready-made, which is to make a ready-made out of something which is of cultural value to a community, which happens to be an indigenous community, which is not to be disregarded, given the political and economic and historical relations with indigenous communities throughout the world. So we can't say it's just any community. It's a particularly loaded and charged community. So that point that they were not indigenous nor from that community as artists made it a troubled area that was very interesting to me. And I also tried to keep the judgment of my politics separate. It's interesting because how can we keep politics and aesthetics separate? We try to keep them together always. But I also believe that there is, as an Adornian, I also believe that there is an indirect politics to things that is sometimes not visible, a sort of politics of form that is much more important and deeper in ways than the first level, which is it politically correct in its content, in its immediate content. And sometimes works that are politically correct in their immediate content are more social realist works than, which are sometimes really great, but they sometimes don't achieve what they want to achieve, but achieve the opposite result. So I'm suspicious of accepting or not accepting an artistic proposal as a curator on the basis of if on the face level it's politically correct or not. I'm a little bit suspicious of that. Also because I know that Marquis de Sade was a revolutionary, you know. So if I take it first level, it's a problem. So I did try to go deeper into it, where I do believe in the politics of form and so on, and looked at it as in the history of the ready-made, and looked at it in the history of the globalization of art, quote unquote, and the discussions that it opened in that, and decided that I would support the project. And we can talk about those reasons. So I would support it as an artistic project. I believed in it. But the troubled waters were what we said just a minute ago. And there was another troubled thing. I mean, when they spoke to me, Nico and Guillermo, about it, they spoke to me clearly as a project that had to do with a repetition and a reversal of this displacement of things, material resources and human resources. And they happen to be also Jewish, the way Kentridge is Jewish, South African. So he's white, but he's also belonging to a community with a history of pogroms and displacements and the whole history of his family in the 1800s and what brought his great-grandfather to to South Africa in the first place, and why his father is Sidney Kentridge, one of the people who drafted the South African Constitution and was the defender in the Steve Biko trials, has something to do with William's work and with William's background. And so this double bind, in a way, of being both white and South African somehow is important to know when you look at William's work, you know, why he does represent in some way this trauma of oppression and alterity legitimately, in a way. You know, he both is and is not in that condition of the South African condition. So similarly, Nico and Guillermo have this history to them which make them particularly sensitive to certain issues that have to do with cultural property rights, and within which this whole project was also embedded. So that's just something I wanted to add that complicates it, because it's always nice, as Donna Haraway says, to stay with the trouble, you know, to complicate it more and more and more before we go to some sort of... So we just complicated it, the meteorite story. Now, what would be... So they did not propose to do a swapping, so I can't really say what they would propose. But I don't know if that would have... That's a very good suggestion. I mean, had they maybe proposed something like that, maybe there would have been a consensus, but actually not. Because what I understood in the community in Chaco, in that town, which is a very particular town. It's a very specific, the capital of the Chaco region is a town where Lucho Fontana, speaking about Argentina, had done certain things, and there's a special biennale of sculpture that every year happens in that town. So this question of the objects and the material presence of objects is very much about that town. So somehow this artwork, I mean, the artists coming into that town every year and doing sculpture in public spaces was connected with the background of why Nico and Guillermo, coming from Buenos Aires, wanted to go and do this thing, which was a sort of reversal of participating in the in this what today is a provincial biennale, but in the 1950s was a really important biennale when there was these things happening in the last epoch of modernism in the 50s, in that period. So we don't know what they would bring. I mean, but I don't think it would have changed the outcome, because the necessity, what was needed by the indigenous community there, was a condition in which to rebel and go against the official government. In other words, what we ultimately provided as a political effect was that the Documenta 13 canceled the loan, even though the governor of Chaco accepted to lend it. And even though the Minister of Science in Buenos Aires accepted, because meteorites are cultural heritage in Argentina. They passed a law because of all these people who steal meteorites. And this particular meteorite had been on a truck. In 1972, some American was going to sell it. It was almost on the boat to go to Nevada or someplace, to some collector of meteorites. And the military had actually stopped that. This is before the desaparecidos period. There's these pictures on the internet about the Chaco on the truck, you know, and it gets put back. So all of this is in the background, and it's in the book that Nico and Guillermo made about the project, because what we have today is 2 volumes of a book. The first book came out a year before the Documenta. I didn't even tell the world that they were invited to Documenta. It's one of those clues that I put out. We showed a small chip of the meteorite that is in the museum in Buenos Aires, not in the Chaco field, already had been displaced by the government of Argentina to their science museum in Buenos Aires. And it's a small object that had been cut in half by German scientists at the Planck Institute, and half this piece of the Chaco meteor, because the meteor is big and then goes through the atmosphere, shatters into many pieces and falls and becomes meteorites. So this small piece, which is called Taco maybe, was split in 2 in 60s in Planck Institute, and half was given to the American Smithsonian Museum, and half was given to the Buenos Aires, back to Argentina, and kept in the Museum of Science in Buenos Aires. The Buenos Aires half is rusty because it's outdoors in the garden. And the Smithsonian half is absurdly polished, never had been exhibited in a crate, but polished on the inside and outside. Now, this doesn't make sense, because the outside should not be polished because it's in the earth. And the inside, you could say, they polished it to make it look like it looked the minute it was cut. So suddenly there was these 2 lives of these 2 halves that had been separated in the 60s, never had been brought together again. And the first phase of the Nico and Guillermo, let's call it reparation, since we're talking, and wholeness, to make this whole object, if we can get into this Melanie Klein business, was to actually borrow from the Smithsonian half and from the Buenos Aires Museum, the other half, put them together somewhere near Kassel. And this was the first part of the Documenta project. And we did it. And they could never have achieved it without the leverage of the Documenta, because the Smithsonian would never lend you the thing. So we borrowed the spaces of the Frankfurt Porticus space, which is 1 hour from Kassel. I talked to Daniel Birnbaum, who was the director at the time, said, can we do this show? And it has to appear as just a solo show of these 2 people. He said, but nobody's ever heard of these 2 people. I mean, Nico and Guillermo, they're not artists. I mean, they were very young. One was just a student, and I mean, they had done exhibitions, but locally in Argentina, and they were not in the art world, in the official art world. So I said, well, it doesn't matter. They're going to be in the Documenta a year from now, and you'll be the prehistory. I'll just, you know, they can have this on their curriculum, CV. And he said, okay, as long as we don't have to pay for it. So the Documenta paid for this project, and we brought the two halves together. And there's the most magnificent pictures of, if we look for them, hopefully. There you see through the door the two halves. There are the two halves. Now when you went close to it, now it's interesting because they had wanted to put them together. But actually, because of the structural weight requirements, we couldn't do that because these are extremely heavy. Even though they're only this big, they're really, really heavy. So you can't put a certain amount of weight, over a certain amount of weight, onto any square meter of a building. You have to, it's like 200 kilos per square meter or something. And so we had to separate them a little bit. Well, they did it, you know, and that separation made this incredible space that we were talking about, the Barad space that we were talking about, that space that is and is not. And surely they were magnetically connected, very much so. There's a specific field that's going on. And one was totally polished, and the other was totally rusty. And it shouldn't have been rusty. This is the one from Buenos Aires. I can see that from here. Rusty. It's the Mocoy. The Mocoy people have almost all been exterminated. There are more living in Paraguay now. Oh, that's interesting, installing them.
Can I ask a
yes.
question? Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. I have, as a kind of, I admitted this before that I haven't been to the Documenta. I've actually never been to a Documenta.
That's okay. You will go to the next one, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, certainly. How, as a visitor,
yes.
I mean, you were talking about we have it in the Documenta. When I go there, I go in. Is that actually when I'm at the Documenta?
No, you don't see any document of this except you see the book.
Or is the Googling it, the knowing about people, the catalog, you know, all these things that are not in the Documenta, like kind of, you know, locally, physically, geographically.
Hold on, just hold on. I'll show you.
Yeah, is that the Documenta?
No, of course not. It's part of the Documenta. It's one of the many levels of the Documenta.
If not, you know, how do you make it happen?
Well,
you know, with visitors.
I can answer that question.
The palimpsestic, you know, what you mentioned, the multidirectional memory, maybe, you know, certain things that allow for depth, that allow kind of, you know, for this mingling,
well, I'm going to try to tell you all
this dance that Haraway says.
I understand the question.
Yeah.
And it's a case-by-case situation. And I can show you this case. Just hold on and I'll show you.
Yeah.
So this is Porticus a year before. Oh.
1 second.
Yes, 1 second.
You're not connected yet.
Oh, why am I not connected? Oh, in many, many manifold ways, and it's a case-by-case basis. In the case of Fajvovic and Goldberg, I will show you what was in the Documenta, but of course it's not what was in, it's a picture of what was in. I'll show you now. There was a cube of iron outside in front of the Friedrichianum, which has the same weight as the Chaco meteor, and which was placed not far from where the Earth kilometer was of Walter de Maria.
It's okay, it's holding up.
But now, first, let me get to these other pictures. So, because I'm looking to show you. I'm looking to show you. What is your first name? Brenda. Yes, Brenda. So this is the Taco book that we published. So in the Documenta, in the bookshop in Kassel, you would have this Taco book that you could buy, and you could also look at. And it tells the story of the preceding piece, which is the Taco piece of bringing it together. Okay? So you had that. Then this is just Nico and Guillermo in front of an idyllic cornfield, which actually is GMO cornfield from Monsanto. This is in Buenos Aires, the outdoor of the Taco meteorite. And you can see that it's rusty on the inside. This is at the time when they drew the line on the Taco to cut it in two. This image is published in the book. This is the digging up of the Taco, because there's an incredible violence on the land that I spoke about yesterday in the digging it up even. I mean, according to the traditional, most traditional indigenous people would say that they should all be buried underground. They shouldn't be out there in this 1970s tourist natural reserve park where tourists can go see it, although nobody goes. So this is the book of the Campo del Cielo, and okay, so this is one thing. Now what I'm going to look for is to answer your question. The second place in which it's located is oh, that's Buenos Aires Museum. So we're talking about the prehistory of Documenta in a way, because the only way that you knew, this is parts of the book, the only way that you knew that this was somehow part of the Documenta before you went to Kassel in June of 2012, 12, was the fact that that book has the logo of Documenta 13. So if you were careful, you would look and say, what the hell does this have to do with Documenta 13? And if you saw the book online or in a bookshop, it was distributed before. But nobody really asked, and nobody wondered why Documenta 13 was publishing books prior to the exhibition. It was normal because we were also publishing the notebooks, so why not? You know, Carolyn wants to be a publishing house. But so nobody asked, is this the prehistory of something? Are these artists invited to the Documenta 13, or is it just a book? This is the project. As it was proposed, I mean, written up by me, let's say, you know, on the basis of their ideas and with them. We can read. I'm going to answer you, but we can't jump. I mean, I know that each question is really important, but I don't think we should jump. We should just take our time, because if we tell one story instead of 5, it's okay. But at least we'll have the background. So this is what I was writing before this whole thing happened, right? Trying to argue for it, because I would have to submit everything to the board of directors, but they would always approve. So there's a standard policy that the board of directors approves everything unless you say you want to go bankrupt. And so, but you formally give in all the papers. So these are papers. So I connected it with the Walter de Maria, as you can read there. I don't have to read it. Oh, but I can't answer your question then. No, then hold on just a second. I'm going to show you what was in the Documenta. Okay, no, but you asked the question, and so I should show you something, at least something. But it's not, oh, you have to run, but I wanted to. Anyway, there was a gallery space, then I won't be able to show you the pictures, but there was a gallery space which I will show your colleagues, which was a quite large space, this size, where there was a video that they made about their whole project that didn't, the meteor didn't come, and it was more a poetic body art video about hugging and being with this object. And then there was some letters and texts about the whole story of the rejection and how the whole decision came about, that they decided to not bring the meteorite anymore because it was, they give it up together with me. And so that was in a vitrine. And then outside there was a sculpture which is in the same weight as the Chaco meteor, but looked like, it looked a little bit like a Piero Manzoni Socle du Monde. Which was done in a foundry near Kassel. So that the actual feeling of magnetism, because it was solid iron, the feeling of magnetism and the bugs around it did agglomerate, as it would have had the meteorite come. And then they organized a day of conference around this question of indigenous rights and the politics of this. So they used some of their budget to do a kind of a performative day of conference lecture.
But I think that was a very pertinent question.
Yes, very good question.
One of the things obviously that's coming up is this question of
place and place it and displace
it. Well, no, but the whole process by which it comes into being, and then of course some things turn up as installations or works, and we also could talk about the other things that didn't turn up, because there's also absences and
Yes,
It says, wait a
not
minute.
so many. This was one of the clearest examples of a failed project, but I don't believe in failure. I think it's a successful project.
But as Leah said, it became, you know, she was interested in the proposition as it's written in the beginning of your essay, you know, about what this
Yeah, so we will do
what
this,
this
then hold out those thoughts and let's have
Yeah.
lunch.
Question, so